My name is Brett Brewster, and today I am going to be walking you through a application that I built called Seed to Market. It is an application for a hypothetical small side business growing herbs. It is used to track inventory as well as gather business data and help make business projections and assumptions. It tracks plants from the time they are planted as a seed all the way up until the time that they are sold at a market, hence the name Seed to Market. And it is built using Laravel. It's my first time building an application using Laravel, and actually my first time with the MVC architectural pattern, but I really enjoyed it. Definitely spent a lot of time with the documentation, but overall it's a powerful framework, and I had a fun time with it. So the first minute or two here, I'm going to go over the design process that I used, and then I'm going to give a quick demonstration of the functionality. So the first thing I did for designing this was create a concept and purpose statement that really helped me clarify who I was building this for, what they would use it for, and why they would use it for those things. Then I drafted it visually on a dry erase board. One of the first things I drew up was this dashboard actually right here, because I wanted to know before I built the back end side of things what information I needed to be able to draw out of the tables in the database. So this was one of the first things that I actually drew out. And once I was confident with what numbers I needed to get, then I started to define the application's backend structure. And then once I was confident with that, I went ahead and started to create the application. So I built out the models, the migrations, the controllers, and the views. And then I started to create the actual data that you see here. Before I did that, though, I did research what realistic data would look like. I have grown spearmint and peppermint indoors, but I just wanted to make sure that the data I was putting in here was realistic to what an actual grower might see. So without further ado, let's get to it. Let's demonstrate this application's capabilities. So this is the crops tab. The crop table in the database houses information about each species. And all of this information that we see here is actually drawn from the plants table, and we will get to that in just a second here after the trays. So here we have our two trays. Each one has a capacity of 6, so just the small little trays can have up to 6 plugs in it. We see that this tray has 6 and this one only has 4. Here is the plants tab. This houses information about every single plant that is grown by this side business. So we see some plants are in the sprouting stage. That means that they are still in a tray. Some plants have been potted, and then some plants have been sold. Then over here in the locations tab, we have our 2 grow areas, and this shows the number of trays and the number of pots in each of those grow areas. We also have in here the conditions for each room on any given day, the minimum and maximum temperature, as well as the number of light hours. So let's walk through actually how we would use this. Let's create a new species that we're going to grow, lavender. And before I make a lavender plant, I just want to point out something here. So if you notice, this tray is a much more vibrant green color than this tray. This tray is almost more of a yellow, and that is because of this volume down here. So the hue will change. This is 120 hue, and this is going to be an 80 hue because it's 2/3 of 120. So this just changes from a 0 hue, which would be red if the volume was 0, all the way up to 120. So it's just reflection of the volume that this tray has. So we're going to see when we add another plant, this is going to get a little bit more green. But just to emphasize this, we are going to change the capacity here to 60. And now it's in terms of ratios, 1/15, so we see that it's very red there. And I'll switch this back to 6. And now let's make our lavender plant. So here we have lavender. We're going to put it in tray number 2. And all this data we're not going to worry about right now because that's data that we're going to edit later. But since we just planted this, we don't have a transfer date or a pot that it's going into or anything like that. So here we see our new lavender pot, or our new lavender plant rather. And if we go into crops now, we are going to see that we have one plant in a tray. And if we go into our trays, we'll see that it's closer to this ideal green color because it is now 5/6 as opposed to 4/6 in terms of its volume. Now let's go through and make some more data so that crops section is a little bit more filled. So we're going to say the 12th in bedroom, and we're going to say we sold it on the 23rd for $3.95. So there we go. Now we can see that it has changed color and it has changed its symbol. And now if we go over here to the crops, now all this data is filled out because we have at least one plant that has went through the entire cycle. So here's our revenue, our sell value, germination, and sell time, and all that good stuff. So now that we've seen how the small business would track their inventory, now let's look at the business projections that we can get from that. So here we have our total time. That's just based on today, which is the 25th, and it subtracts from that the 1st of February, which was our starting day for this project. Here we have our revenue, and what it's doing to get that is going in and looking at all the plants which have sold and just adding up what each one sold for and then rounding the value. Here we have an annual revenue projection. That's simply a linear projection based on revenue per days. So we would expect, since our revenue is a little bit more than $1 per day, that this would be a little bit more than 365, which is what we see. One issue, actually there's two issues that I see with this linear way of projecting the revenue. The first is if this grow operation was outdoors as opposed to indoors, and it was outdoors in a place that was seasonal, you wouldn't be able to use a linear projection because most of your sales are going to be during a very short period of the year. So you would have to change how you're making this projection. A second issue that I potentially see is because we were planting things from seed right off the get-go, we had about 50 days where there wasn't any revenue coming in. It took about 50 days for the first seeds to actually grow into plants that were sellable. So if we wanted to account for that in this particular scenario, we would go down to our daily revenue here, and instead of dividing by our total number of days, we would divide by our total number of days minus 50, because 50 is the number of days it took for us to start generating revenue. And once we do that, we see that our annual revenue projection is much higher. And this goal down here is actually just a variable in here. So we can see once we change that to 1,000, it's going to update this value, and then it's also going to update what percent on target we are. So this is just rounding the annual revenue projection divided by what our goal is. So now down to our key productivity indicators. We have our revenue potential for the year, and I'm actually going to come back to this one because in order to properly explain this, I actually have to first go over what this RP cubed variable is. So after I go through the crops, I will come back and explain this one at the very end of this video. So here we have our current tray efficiency. That is the number of trade plants, which is determined by going into the plants table and counting all of the plants which don't have a transfer date yet and dividing that by the tray capacity to get a percentage. And then we have our average germination and our average cell time. What it's doing to get these is going through all of the plants, and if they have a cell date or a transfer date, then it is pulling out the start date and the germination date and determining the number of days between those two, adding it to a variable, and then dividing it by the total number of plants that have been germinated or sold to get our average germination and cell time. Down here we have our inventory, which simply tracks the total number of plants that we have planted, how many are in trays, how many are in pots, and how many have sold. We also have our tray capacity here. This is just counting the capacity of each tray added together. And then here we have information about each species specifically. So we see how many are in trays, how many are in pots, and how many have sold. We have the net revenue and the average cell value, and this cell value is quite simply the net revenue divided by the number of plants that have sold. The average germination and the average cell time of each of these are derived in the same way that these two are derived. And then we have an average daily revenue that's based on the cell value divided by the cell time. So we would use this average daily revenue if we were really limited on space and we really wanted to maximize our profit based on that small space. So in that case, we would want to have a high average daily revenue, because assuming everything is in the same 6-inch pot, we want each of those pots to be producing as much money as possible per day. Then we also have a RP cubed value, and what that stands for is revenue potential per plug. So what this is saying is if we dedicated one of these 12 spots exclusively to planting spearmint, and every time we transferred a plant from that particular spot into a pot, we planted a new one. So if we do that, and I'll pull up a calculator here to run you through the calculation that it's doing. So if we do that, we have 365 days in a year. We have 15 days as the average germination time. So that means each plug on average should be able to make about 24 plants. And then if we multiply that by our 445 value, we're going to get 108. The reason it's not 108 is because it doesn't round it down until the end. So that extra change, I think it was 24 1/3. And now if we multiply that by 445, yes. So now we round that down to 108 per plug. And of course, that's assuming that we don't lose any plants to disease and we are really dedicated to constantly keeping that single spot planted with something. As soon as we transfer, we plant a new one, that type of a thing. And then that is where we are getting this revenue potential per year. So all of this is the RP cubed value for the highest plant here. So the highest RP cubed value we see down here, which is 108, multiplied by our tray capacity, which is 12, and that gives us our $1,296 per year. So that is the demonstration of this seed to market application. I do have a few things that I would like to add on to it. So the first of which would be creating an expenses tab and an expenses table. That would help because knowing the expenses, we would be able to determine profit margin, we would be able to determine annual profit projections, and then we could determine how percent on target we are for that, because at least for most businesses, the profit would be more important than the revenue. Then another tab that would be interesting to add would be a labor tab, because if we had that, then we could draw how many hours we're spending not only on the side project as a whole, but also on specific aspects of the side project. So how much time are we spending watering? How much time are we spending transplanting? And then based on that information, we could see what equipment would be worth investing in and make conclusions about those type of things. And then finally, we could determine an hourly wage if we had both of those models together. So if we were able to determine the total profit and the total number of hours that we spent on this project, we could determine an hourly wage for this side project. So again, it was really fun to build. It was built using Laravel, and I would love to hear any questions, thoughts, suggestions that you have on it. So until next time, have a good one.